Well, good morning. Today is Friday, and we are beginning episode 69, Deep State Part 2. And this is Standards Plus History Academy, and my name is Barry Jones. And we are looking at the subject today, the question today: how, when, and why did the U.S. government incorporate? So we learned yesterday about the corporation and its operating principle, which was governed by an act called the Ultra Vires Act, which stipulated that as uh, stockholders, which are the owners of a corporation, as management, such as the CIA or CEO, CIA, the CEO or the board of directors, anybody in the command structure involved in the corporation had immunity, personal immunity from any liability taken on as part of the corporation, any action or any consequence of any action taken by the corporation. So personal liability is not anything they had to worry about. They had immunity, full immunity. I think you need to think about that in context. Some of our big corporations today and how they escape accountability time and time again. That was how corporations and this whole corporate mindset began back after the Civil War, before World War One. But it was in the private sector. These were corporations that were in the private sector. Also included at that time, anyway. Also included, and we learned that they had figured out ways to get around uh, liability as far as the corporation was concerned. Uh, Assets were dispersed amongst subsidiaries that were spread out all over the place so that uh, the mother company was protected by these layers of subsidiaries. So if you did sue the corporation for some sort of uh, cause, uh, you would never be able to get the assets or get at the assets of the mother company. They also protected themselves from tax liability by creating shell companies or holding companies and dispersing their profits. So this was the tactic taken by these 50 to 60 people that ran all these companies, these big corporations across the country, and it enabled them to accumulate these enormous fortunes. And you couldn't get at them. The government couldn't even get at them to tax them. And if you were a private citizen trying to sue them for any purpose, you couldn't get at their assets. They were totally protected as a corporation and as personal individuals as well. They were completely protected. And the operating principle of the corporation that governed the actions of the board of directors or the CEO or any whoever ran the company was that public interest did not matter. Public interest was further down the list of priorities. The number one interest or the number one priority was maximizing profits. In fact, you could be fired if it could be proven that when you were weighing a decision that needed to be made, if you took public interest into account and that ended up being prioritized over profits, you could be fired. So it was all about profits. It was all about immunity, personal and corporate, uh, assets and liabilities, all protected. It was about amassing huge fortunes. And it was during that time that we saw these companies amass tremendous fortunes. I don't have to tell you about the Rockefellers and these big monopolies that they created, Standard Oil Trust, and the Vanderbilts, the Morgans, the Carnegies. Uh, I mean, and as a result, uh, politicians, judges, anyone of public note, in order to run for president or any office, needed money. And it was these guys with the fat cats who gave them the money and basically bought the politicians and began injecting, because they basically had a push button authority now. All they had to do is push a button and call up one of the politicians, one of the judges that they bought, that they owned, and get what they wanted. And it's not going to be long before that mindset, that ultra vires mindset, seeps its way into government and transcends or crosses that invisible boundary between private industry, private sector, and public policy. And so what we want to answer today, that question is, how and when did this happen? When did the United States government incorporate? When specifically? What was the event or events that took that ultra vires mindset from private industry, from the private sector into the public sector? When did that happen? And that obsession with profits and that obsession with liability, uh, freedom from liability, immunity from liability, where just as the private industry had been getting away with doing just about anything it wanted, it was free from any sort of consequence. The government could do that. Where just as the private industry had been on this quest for profits and money, the government could now do that. And they could be linked together. I mean, you think about the possibilities. Before, when there was a wall of separation between the two, you could make the argument they were on different sides of the fence. They could be potential adversaries. The government could potentially inhibit private industry's ability to maximize their profits or tax them or pass laws. But if they're on the same team working together, there's nothing to stop it. There's no check. There's no check. So at some point there was a line of demarcation that we passed, that we crossed over. There was a Rubicon River that we crossed. And that's what we want to talk about today, where all of what we discussed yesterday, this corporate mindset and ultra vires, which was private, went public. I've got some pictures here which show the buildup, the arms buildup during World War One, specific to World War One. So you see shipbuilding, you see a factory assembly line there, top right. Looks like they're manufacturing shells. Bottom left, more shells, it appears. You see the flags hanging in the factory to rally the workforce. And then bottom right are tanks. And this is just a sampling, very small sampling. We're going to go through a longer list here. And this is where this corporatization of government, the incorporation of the United States government, begins to happen during World War One. So let's go through some data. The DuPonts, which made, this is one of the largest companies in the world, made gunpowder. And between the years 1910 and 1914, making gunpowder wasn't nearly as profitable as it became. They were making $6 million a year. Between the years 1914 and 1918, the war years for the United States, that same DuPont Corporation made $58 million a year, which is a 10 times profit or a 950% increase in profits. Bethlehem Steel, which between the same years, 1910 and 1914, made a comparable profit as the DuPonts, $6 million a year. In 1914 to 1918, the war years, they went from $6 million to $49 million a year. United States Steel, 1910 to 1914. This was a monster company. Whenever I think of United States Steel, U.S. Steel, I think of that line in Godfather where the character, uh, uh, I forget his character, who he's based on. He was the mob's banker, Meyer Lansky. He's playing the role of Meyer Lansky, and he tells Michael Corleone about the mob and the family business, all the goings on in Cuba. And he says, we're bigger than U.S. Steel. U.S. Steel was a monster company. They were making a good profit between 1910, 1914, $105 million a year. That's before the war. During the war, 1914 and 1918, they made $240 million a year. How about copper? Anaconda Copper, between the years 1910 and 1914, made $10 million a year. 1914 and 1918, the war years, $34 million a year. Utah Copper, 1910 to 1914, $5 million a year. War years, 1914 and 1918, $21 million a year. You take powder, steel, and copper, add up all the companies that are involved in the manufacture, sale, distribution of any one of those three products, add them all together. The average profits, and these are the small ones, the big ones, between 1910 and 1914 is about 140 grand a year. Rather small. Between 1914 and 1918, the average profits was $408.3 million a year. That is a 200% increase. If you are in the business of gunpowder, steel, and copper, war is the best stimulus, economic stimulus plan that has ever been invented. But it doesn't stop with those products. How about leather? All of a sudden, there's going to be a demand for leather, shoe leather, for saddles, for horses, for boots, for soldiers. Central Leather Company, between the years 1910, 1914, made $3.5 million total. It's less than $1 million a year. If you take 4 years, if you spread it over 3 years, it's 1.67 million per year. All right. Warriors, 1914 to 1918, $15 million total, which is a 1,100% increase. U.S. shoe companies sold 35 million pairs of hobnail service shoes to Uncle Sam during the war. Now think about that and compare to how many soldiers we actually had. 35 million pairs were sold to Uncle Sam. We only had 4 million soldiers. So our U.S. government bought 9 times the number of hobnail service shoes that they would need for their 4 million soldiers. McClellan saddles sold hundreds of thousands of saddles for the cavalry, even though we didn't have an overseas cavalry. And the entire war for us was fought overseas. How about chemicals? General Chemical Company, 1910 to 1914, before the war, made about $800,000 a year. Between 1914 and 1918, they made $12 million a year, a 1,400% increase. How about nickel? The International Nickel Company, which advertised itself unbelievably in one of its advertising campaigns. You can't have a war without nickel. 1910 and 1914 made $4 million a year. Between 1914 and 1918, it made $73 million a year. That's a 1,700% increase. How about sugar? The American Sugar Refining Company between the years 1910 and 1914 made $2 million a year. In 1916 alone, it made $6 million. Mosquito netting. Mosquito netting manufacturers sold Uncle Sam 20 million mosquito nets. Remember, we only have 6 million, 4 million soldiers. We only have 4 million soldiers. We sold them 20 million mosquito nets and 40 million yards of extra netting for the use of soldiers overseas, none of which ever reached one soldier in France. It just got stored in a warehouse somewhere. It never made it across the Atlantic. But the contract was consummated. Airplane engines. Uncle Sam spent $1 billion building airplane engines, which not a single one of these ever made it into a battle in France. So here's $1 billion, there's $1 billion, everywhere $1 billion. For airplane engines that were never used, mosquito nets that were never used, 36 million hobnail shoes. We only needed 4 million. Unbelievable. Undershirts for soldiers. And the non-war years, they cost 14 cents to make, even during the war years, 14 cents to make a shirt. Uncle Sam paid 40 cents each for all these undershirts. It's capitalism, right? If you make undershirts and you know Uncle Sam will overpay for them, hey, it's not price gouging. Manufacturers of stockings, uniforms, caps, helmets, knapsacks sold Uncle Sam 4 million, too many of each. Okay, 4 million extra stockings, 4 million extra uniforms, 4 million extra caps, 4 million extra helmets, 4 million extra knapsacks. The extras had to be scrapped after the war because regulations stipulate that the contents of the knapsacks had to be changed, forcing the manufacturers to make and sell the items all over again. Wrenches. There was a particular company in America that sold Uncle Sam 12 dozen 48 inch wrenches. Even though there was only one nut ever made that was ever large enough for these wrenches. And that nut holds the turbines at Niagara Falls. In other words, nowhere in our services, military service, Navy, Army, Marines, Air Force, and nobody had nuts big enough for 48-inch wrenches. And yet this company sold Uncle Sam 12 dozen of these. They were put on freight cars and just went around country looking for anywhere that they could be used. When the war ended, the wrench manufacturer was actually planning to start making nuts big enough for those big wrenches. And they were going to sell those nuts to Uncle Sam. And you know what? Uncle Sam would have bought them. Our government would have bought them. Here's the wrench. Oh, you have nothing to use the wrench on? Okay, we will make you a nut that's big enough. Next, I'm sure they would have made the screw that the nut fit on that was big enough. You just can't make this stuff up. It's comical, but it's not comical because someone's making a fortune. The ship industry. Shipbuilders made more than $3 billion worth of profit during the war. Unbelievably, almost a third of that went to the construction of wooden ships that turned out wouldn't float. When they put them in the water, the seams opened up and they sank. but Uncle Sam had already paid for them. $3 billion worth of profit, shipbuilding. When the war ended, World War I, we're talking about, the Senate had a committee that analyzed all this data to figure out where all this money went. And Senate document 259, the 65th Congress reported on corporate earnings and government revenues during the war. All right. So the war's over, and there's this sense that everybody made a lot of money, did really well. And so they want to tally it up and see just how well we did. Considering the profits of 122 meat packers, 153 cotton manufacturers, 299 garment makers, 49 steel plants, and 340 coal producers during the war. This is part of the analysis of this document by this committee. And according to this document, profits under 25%, this is a direct quote, profits under 25% were exceptional. That was the exception. For instance, the coal companies made between 100% and 7,856% on their capital stock during the war. The Chicago meat packers doubled and tripled their earnings. And let us not forget the bankers who financed the Great War. If anyone had the cream of the profits, it was the bankers. So if anyone is still wondering, the answer to the question, does war pay? According to economists and researchers, World War I cost Uncle Sam $52 billion, out of which $39 billion went to execute the war itself, and $16 billion in profits was spread along or among these corporations that manufactured these goods for Uncle Sam for the war effort, which we've already established is a small group of people. The board of directors of one of these corporations, it's amazing how many of those board of directors are also on the board of directors of other corporations. They intermarry, they keep it amongst themselves. They are the power elites. And so a very small group of people, which according to FDR, by the time we get to World War II, or by the time we get to 1932, 1933, is less than 100 people that are spreading $16 billion worth of profits amongst themselves. This is how we got these dynastic families and these companies, which later will go multinational. You know, right now they're domestic corporations, but that won't last. They'll see opportunity to go multinational, which they are now, and even increase their profits yet again. The Senate Nye Committee estimated the World War I profits to have been in excess of 300%, 600%, and 1,600%, depending upon what industry you're talking about. And in their words, this war industry turned blood into gold. And it doesn't take a genius to figure out, looking at these bottom lines, that war is lucrative. War is very lucrative. And of course, you know, the boogeymen in here are the industries that were named, because they have, you know, we can see their profits. But according to the Senate committee that looked into this, they said the bankers did even better. They're the ones who financed the whole war itself. They're the ones who did the best. And they didn't even really itemize the profits of the banks. My goodness. My goodness. So that was World War I. And if you're stunned by those numbers, World War II took everything from World War I, put it on steroids. And of course, World War II doesn't happen long after. So what we see during World War I is the corporatization or the incorporation of government, where uh, because of these fat government projects or contracts, these corporations are making stupendous profits. And then, of course, with those profits, they're going to turn around and support those politicians in order to continue to get those contracts. So this is when the Ultra Vires doctrine begins to seep its way into the U.S. government. In the World War II era, we start to see the militarization of government, during which government now, because it realizes such profits can be made and what an economic stimulus war is, now begins to enact policies to continue this, to amp it up, to not, it used to be in the American experience, when the war ended, we went through a period where we demobilized and we wound everything down because we were in peace. We didn't need all these things. And to an extent, we demobilized after World War I, but not nearly like we had in the past, because we got addicted to this money spigot. And so for the next war, instead of waiting to the last minute, let's just continue to mobilize so that at least we're prepared. And that was the argument made to the American people: preparedness. Let's not wait till the last minute. But there was so much money to be made. And so where World War I began corporatizing or incorporating our government, World War II turned our government into a permanent military industry. And we began to see, beginning of World War II and throughout, and certainly afterwards, industry and finance leaders from the private sector who were in the business of making these war materials moving into government, bringing with them their Ultra Vires doctrine, which is profits over public interest. Washington, D.C. was taken over by business executives, lawyers from Wall Street, investment bankers, all these folks involved in this money-making venture that will help us win World War II. And indeed, they did. I mean, FDR called us the arsenal of democracy, out of necessity, because our allies couldn't do it. Britain was undergoing in World War II the Blitz, the nightly air attacks by the Luftwaffe. All their factories were destroyed. Russia, at some point, was under assault by 3 Hitler armies, and its infrastructure was destroyed. France was already defeated. And so America, which is largely untouched, had to build the military hardware for its allies, and we did it a bang-up job. The infrastructure had been put in place. We had the right people in government to facilitate this, and all we had to do was push a button. And so we built more military hardware during World War II by ourselves, the United States, than the Axis powers combined. For example, Germany produced 20,000 tanks during World War II, and the Germans had good tanks. We produced 55,000, almost 3 times the amount. Total, there were 600,000 airframes to the mechanical structure of an airplane, like you see pictured here, produced during World War II. The Allies produced 400,000, 2/3 of them, and we produced most of those. That factory, that picture on the top, as far as the eye can see, you're looking down at production facility there. You can't even see the end of them. There's so many. None of the Axis powers were ever able to produce a 4-engine bomber. They didn't have the know-how. They didn't have the technology. They didn't have the the expertise, the knowledge. They didn't have anything uh, to do to be able to do it. The Americans and British produced 40,000 of them. 40,000 of these. By 1945, the U.S. GDP is reflected in this graph above, which is the military spending being the primary driver of all this, was larger than Germany, Italy, Japan, Britain, and the Soviet Union combined. You see the spike. If you look at that graph between, and I've given you all the data between the years 1910 and 1914, which is pre-World War I, it's climbing. But then between 1914 and 1918, you see it just continues to climb. It dips a little after the war. Boom. World War II, look what it does. So if you are an economist, or if you're an analyst, financial analyst in these companies or at the United States government, and you're examining over the last 20, 30 years, when did we have the best economy? When did we have full employment? When did all these big companies prosper? When was their great wealth created? It was during World War I. To a large degree, that was our first taste. And during World War II, we got hooked on it. So World War I was like the gateway drug. It was marijuana. It's what got us hooked. And World War II, by the end of World War II, we were addicts by that point to the money. Interesting little statistic about World War II. It's the first time in the human experience that a war was lost by the side that killed the most people. And they lost to the country or to the nations, to the allies, to the group, whatever, to the side who built the most stuff. So all of a sudden, it wasn't so much more about human life anymore. Now it's about munitions. The Axis powers killed over 80% of those total killed in the war. That's astounding. Everybody wants to talk about the Germans and the Holocaust, and they killed a lot of Russians. And the Japanese killed a lot of Chinese. 80% of those killed total in the war were killed by the Axis, and they lost. The Allied powers built 80% of the munitions used in the war, and they won. And so now the calculation is, it's not about soldiers, human life. Now it's about stuff. It's about armaments. It's about weapon systems. It's about ships and planes and tanks. And of course, as we go forward after World War II, it'll be about nuclear capabilities and delivery systems, nuclear weapons, submarines. And all of that costs money. It really frustrated the Germans. We gave the Russians, we just give them to them. We didn't charge them. We just give them 2,000 locomotives, a bunch of Dodge trucks they needed. The Germans called the American hardware automatons, or automatic robots, complaining that, quote, these damn Americans have motorized their divisions, and 70% of our divisions are driven by horses. They have an oil war. We have a grass war. So here's my point. We've been talking about the deep state and the origins. What we start to see is a merging of interests as a result of World War I and World War II. That was my question beginning today. When did the United States government incorporate? And the answer to that question is World War I and World War II. World War I is when it began, and these companies got a taste of the profits that could be made. And so when it looked like there was another war in the offing, they injected or inserted their people, their corporate people into government, into key positions in government to help facilitate the buildup for a bigger war, a longer lasting war, a more cataclysmic war, a more expensive war, a more profitable war. And this is where you get this uh, merging of these three interests. You have these corporations, which are now multinationals. Back then they weren't, but now they are. That's the CEOs, that's the Wall Street lawyers, that's the bankers, all the folks involved in what used to be the private sector corporate world. You still have them, but now you have the machinery of the state. You have the politicians, Congress, which appropriates all the money for these big contracts, government agencies, which submit budgets asking for these weapon systems, cabinet positions that advocate for their different departments. And that's where the money comes from, right? So you need the politicians because they vote the money. And you need the companies because they make the stuff. And of course, you need the military because they're the ones who use the stuff. And so they're the ones who are going to go to the politicians and say, we need this many bombers, we need this many ships, we need this many tanks. And then the politicians vote the money in, give the contracts to the corporations build it. And then the corporations who are the beneficiaries of these big fat contracts and getting rich donate money to the political campaigns and the next round of politicians who are going to vote the next round of these contracts when the next war happens and the military asks for their next wave of military equipment. And that's your power elite. It's an unholy trinity of corporations, the U.S. military, and the politicians. Eisenhower, speechwriters, we're going to learn this tomorrow, or either tomorrow or next week, gives that famous speech about the military industrial complex. The speechwriters, when they wrote the speech, originally included, they didn't call it the military industrial complex. They called it the military industrial congressional complex because it took all three. When Eisenhower read the speech, he scratched out the word congressional so as to alleviate politicians from this scenario. Even though without Congress, without the politicians, none of the rest of this happens. They're the ones who vote the money. But he took that out because he's giving the speech at the end. It's his farewell speech. He's given this at the end of his 8 years in office. And during the time that he was in office, we had a tremendous military buildup. And he did nothing about it. He facilitated the buildup. And so it pointed at him and it pointed at his buddies in politics. And so he took that out so as not to offend the politicians and those in government and relieve them of any responsibility in this scenario. But that's the original speech. Those are the original words, the military industrial congressional complex, as evidenced by this power elite diagram here. You can't have the military industrial complex without the cooperation and complicity of Congress, of the government. And of course, President signs these budgets. He proposes the budget, Congress votes it, and then it's signed into law by the president. So it makes sense if you're in these big corporations to donate lots of money to all these politicians who will continue to vote your way, giving the military everything they ask for. which provides these fat contracts to these multinational corporations who make all the stuff. And one hand scratches the back of the other. And that's how it works. So to answer our question we asked at the beginning of today is, when did the United States government incorporate? World War I and World War II. And we haven't been the same since. You look at, if you go back before World War I, our first experience fighting a foreign war was Spanish-American. After the Spanish-American War, we demobilized. We went back to business as usual. We never did that again. We've never done that since. World War I, there was a period of demobilization, but it wasn't as if we were completely at peace. We could not unwind the buildup, which had been so dramatic in World War I. We could not completely unwind it all. It had been too drastic. And so we continued building at a higher rate than ever before. The contracts continued unabated. The politicians continued signing these budgets, providing the money. And then when World War II happened, we amped it up even more. And when World War II ended, the demobilization that we were accustomed to that normally happened never did occur, because we just transcended from one war into the Cold War. We went from World War I to World War II to the Cold War. And if you look at our history since, we've pretty much been at war ever since. And if anyone wants to know why, go back and look at some of those figures I showed you of the money that was made in World War I, specific dollar amounts, the percent increase during the war years versus the non-war years. Look at the production capacity that netted us in World War II. And of course, World War I profits of shoe leather and gunpowder and mosquito netting does not compare to World War II profits of aircraft carriers, tanks, anti-aircraft guns, submarines, ships, and on it goes. And then that doesn't compare to the post-World War II era of nuclear weapons, delivery systems, all the weapons that we utilize in space, on it goes. In other words, the money trough, the money spigot in World War I got turned on. And then after World War I, it didn't get turned off. And then in World War II, we turned it on full blast. And then after World War II, instead of turning it back off or turning it down, we left it on full blast and we turned on the hot. And both spigots have been flowing full speed ever since. At some point here soon, I'm going to show you budgets, military budgets, the amount of spending and what it has done, going back to the Spanish-American War, pre-World War I days to where it is now. And you'll see what I'm talking about. You'll see that those spigots are flowing fast and furious. So to answer my question about the deep state and its origins, it started with these corporate head honchos, these 50, 60 people that are running the corporations, the biggest corporations, which means they're running the U.S. economy. And because of their donations to the political system, they're really running the government. And the wars just intensified that. And now you have 50 to 60 people who have their hands on all the levers of power, making fantastic profits, owning these politicians, expecting, demanding that these politicians do their bidding because they've been bought and paid for. And if a politician comes along, any politician, at any point in time comes along and says no, or objects, or threatens to turn off these money spigots, Well, that's trouble. So you can see we're leading somewhere here. I'm just laying the groundwork. So anyway, that's today's. It's episode 69. And we'll be back tomorrow with episode 70. And check out my website, sphistory.com. Also, feel free to join the website, subscribe. It's free. Give me a thumbs up, hit the notification bell. And until tomorrow, everybody have a great day. Thank you.